Tonight, you're not here for a heroic montage or a clean, satisfying ending. Tonight, you're walking slowly along the quiet edge of the Timurid world, where power doesn't always speak with speeches, but with things that stay standing after the hooves are gone. 3 small senses to keep you company: a desert wind combing dust in long, careful strokes, a distant drum fading like it remembered it's late, and stone tapping stone in a slow, obedient rhythm tap. Pause, tap. Like the night itself is counting calmly for you. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch how a conquest can leave behind a second language, not ink, but architecture. You'll feel how warning becomes a system, how rumor moves along trade routes faster than any army, how travelers lower their voices without knowing why, how a city can decide to surrender before it sees the banners, simply because the story arrived first. And you'll notice the unsettling practicality under it all. Fear doesn't require perfect accuracy, only consistency. When terror becomes routine, it starts to behave like policy, measurable, repeatable, negotiable until it isn't. If your breathing wants something steady, let it borrow that stone rhythm. Inhale 4, hold. Exhale 6, good, nothing to solve right now. Just a slow walk through how reputation can become a structure you can see from far away. And a quick clear note before we go deeper: if you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive history, soft voice, slow pacing, and stories that unwind gently, you can subscribe so these nights keep finding you. And if you want to help the channel more than you think, you can leave a like only if you genuinely liked the vibe. It quietly tells the algorithm, yes, more of this. Also, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments like a tiny postcard. I read them and it helps me picture the world this story is traveling through. Now, let's step closer to the road behind the army, the part history remembers in silence. The Timurid message, in many accounts, was designed to travel ahead of the army as if it were its own messenger. A structure that could be seen from a distance doesn't need to chase anyone. It just needs to exist in the right place, at the right height, under the right sky. People notice tall things. We are built for noticing tall things. It is one of our more inconvenient instincts, like noticing someone opening a bag of chips in a silent room. And the point of a public warning is not subtlety. It is a kind of architecture that doesn't want you to admire it. It wants you to adjust your behavior, ideally before you even arrive. The towers themselves were not built for beauty in the way gardens are built for beauty, or in the way a well-made cup is built for beauty. They were built to be understood, to be recognized, to be repeated in conversation, which is its own kind of construction project. Whether the numbers in the chronicles are inflated or not, and chroniclers have always had a fondness for big, dramatic numbers, like they're trying to win an argument at a dinner party, the idea stays steady. Make the consequence visible. Make it linger in the eye. Let it keep speaking after the army rides on, because a rumor can stand in place for 1,000 soldiers if it is convincing enough. The unsettling part, even when we keep it at a distance, is how practical it is. Not emotionally practical, not morally practical, but mechanically practical, like a log. It turns fear into a landmark. It makes the landscape itself do the talking. You don't need to send a messenger to every village. If the road is already carrying the story for you, people will deliver it for free. They will tell it to each other in marketplaces, at wells, in the soft moments before sleep. And once a story becomes a habit, it doesn't need fresh details. It just needs to be told in the same tone, with the same certainty, so it feels like weather. A message needs an audience, and the Timurid world had many. Merchants and pilgrims, yes, but also the quiet machinery of scribes, officials, and people who wrote things down because writing things down feels like control. A scribe can turn chaos into columns. A clerk can turn a city into a set of names, and rumor has its own mathematics. It takes a word like many and, with a few retellings, turns it into countless. It takes we lost and turns it into we vanished. It takes they were harsh and turns it into they are inevitable. It's not precise, but it is consistent, and consistency is often what fear requires. Fear is not a scholar, it is a commuter. It wants the fastest route to certainty. You can imagine a roadside inn where the food is forgettable and the floor is slightly sticky in the way all floors become when enough people pass through. Someone arrives with dust on their sleeves and a voice that is too quiet. Someone else leans in because leaning in makes you feel informed. And the story is told not as a scream, but as a practical warning, like telling someone the bridge ahead is weak. The details sharpen, the timing gets neater. The geography grows more confident. By the third telling, it almost sounds like the speaker was there, even if they were actually at home reorganizing their grain sacks in a perfectly peaceful manner. And scribes, when they get involved, can harden rumor into something that feels official. Chronicles can become like stamped documents, not because they are always accurate, but because ink has authority. A written number can feel more real than a living memory, which is unfair to memories because they are doing their best. But the point is not to keep perfect records. The point is to spread a pattern. A policy of intimidation doesn't need to be flawlessly measured. It needs to be reliably expected, the way people expect winter or taxes or a neighbor to comment on your life choices. Then there is the darker sophistication of contrast. Terror in the system works best when it is paired with selective mercy, not as kindness, but as a lever. One city resists and becomes an example. Another submits and is spared, and that memory becomes a bargain people can point to. The choice starts to feel like simple survival logic: open the gate now, or gamble with your future. It is less like a battlefield and more like an unpleasant negotiation where the terms are not written down, but everyone understands them anyway. The towers, in that sense, are not only punishment, they are a kind of argument. They are the Empire's way of saying, we have already decided what happens when you say no. A desert wind combs dust the way a careful hand combs hair, slowly, without a goal beyond moving the smallest things from one place to another. Far away, a drum forgets itself and fades, as if it has decided to be polite. And somewhere close, stone taps stone in a steady rhythm that doesn't hurry you, and doesn't ask you to follow. If you can let the room stay exactly as it is. Let the air do what it was already doing. In the Timurid world, campaigns could move quickly, but what people remembered was often what remained after the horse hooves left. Not the dramatic charge, not the speech, not the heroic painting that comes later, but the empty streets that suddenly had more space than they were designed for. The shut doors that seemed to learn a new habit. The shops that kept their shutters closed a little longer, as if wood could improve its judgment by thinking harder. History has many famous roads, but the road behind an army is a special kind of road because it is paved with pauses. It is a road where even the birds might sound cautious simply because caution becomes the local accent. You can picture a crossroads outside a city where trade routes usually behave like busy hallways, merchants counting bundles, pilgrims counting steps, envoys counting the minutes until someone important allows them to stand in the correct place. And then suddenly the counting changes. It becomes less about profit or prayer and more about distance. How far is far enough to be safe? How close is too close to be noticed? It's oddly administrative in a way. Fear has paperwork energy. It loves lists. It loves boundaries. It loves a sign that says, in effect, please do not test this system. It is strange how the human mind responds to the idea of a deal, even when the deal is brutal. People look for rules because rules feel safer than randomness. If the world is cruel but predictable, you can plan. You can prepare food. You can hide valuables. You can send children away early. You can practice being silent. Even mercy, when it is used strategically, becomes part of the rulebook. It teaches people that obedience is not just submission, but a transaction. And once fear becomes transactional, it begins to behave like a system, repeatable, teachable, and tragically effective. Now, very gently, imagine being a traveler who sees an outline on the horizon before hearing the name of the city. You are not in the middle of a scene of action. You are simply moving through the world in the slow way people always move through the world, with a horse that has opinions and a bag that isn't balanced quite right. You see something tall. Your first thought might be neutral. Maybe it's a tower, maybe it's a monument, maybe it's a watch post. And then you recognize what it means, or you suspect what it might mean, and your body changes its posture without asking permission from your brain. You slow down. You lower your voice, even though there is no one right beside you, because the act of lowering your voice makes you feel less visible. Every sound feels louder than it should. The jingle of harness metal becomes a little rude. The crunch of gravel becomes a declaration. And even if you never touch the place, never step inside the walls, never see the streets, you are already being controlled by it. That is part of the point. The structure does its work without needing any new violence. It sits there like a sign that says this happened, and then quietly adds, and it could happen again. The way a stern teacher doesn't have to raise their voice to change the whole room. Fear, in this traveling form, is exhausting. It makes the world feel larger and smaller at the same time. Larger because the distance to safety feels enormous. Smaller because your choices start to narrow. Which road do you take? Which river crossing do you trust? Which town do you avoid? You start making decisions the way someone scrolls through terms and conditions, quickly, anxiously, and mostly hoping there won't be a surprise at the end. And the night feels different too. Not because the stars change, but because your mind keeps rehearsing possibilities when it should be resting. The same mechanism shapes the story of Timur himself, because reputation is a kind of engine that eats stories and produces more stories. To admirers, he can become inevitable, a ruler who shapes geography the way a hard tool shapes wood. To victims and rivals, he becomes a lesson in what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both sides feed the same machine. Praise and dread both travel well. And once a reputation becomes architecture, once it becomes something you can point at from a distance, it is difficult to dismantle, because you can't argue with a landmark in the same way you can argue with a person. There is also the way later generations handle him, because time has its own habits. Some writers sharpen the story to shock. Some soften it to defend. Some mix politics with fragments of eyewitness accounts, like someone stirring a pot and pretending the ingredients were always meant to go together. The core pattern, though, remains familiar. Intimidation as policy, spectacle as communication. History here is not only what happened, it is what people were trained to believe could happen, which is an unsettling sort of education. It's like being taught very calmly that the door can lock from the outside. And then we reach the problem of numbers, which is where historians tend to sigh and reach for tea. Chronicles disagree on details, how often, how many, where exactly, because terror distorts record keeping. People exaggerate when they are frightened, and sometimes they understate when they are afraid of consequences. A number in a text can be a weapon or a shield, or simply a guess written with confidence. It's not always a lie. Sometimes it's just the only shape available for a memory too heavy to hold. When you can't measure the feeling, you measure the story. When you can't count the loss, you count the rumor. This is why the same event can arrive to us in several costumes. One account will be theatrical, another will be blunt, another will be suspiciously tidy, as if someone cleaned the narrative before letting it into the room. And centuries later, we are left with the awkward job of separating the impulse to impress from the impulse to warn. But even if the exact numbers shift, the intention is stable enough to see. The method is stable. the system is stable. It is the stability that matters, because stability is what makes a policy repeatable. If you're listening to this at night as intended, you can keep the scene at a distance. You don't need to step closer in your imagination. You can stay with the moonlight on stone, the wind over empty ground, the idea of a warning that doesn't need to shout. The calmness is part of what makes it effective and part of what makes it heavy. Not because the narration is dramatic, but because the mechanism is simple. A message that can be seen. A story that can be retold. A choice that feels like it isn't really a choice. And if you end softly, you can end on the human scale, because human scale is what we can actually hold. A traveler choosing the safer road, not because it is more beautiful, but because it is less likely to demand a decision. A city choosing surrender, not because it loves surrender, but because surrender looks like tomorrow. A messenger choosing silence because silence is sometimes the only currency left that can't be taxed or stolen. The night settles again, the horizon blurs. The wind keeps rearranging the dust as patiently as ever, and the world returns to small sounds, the tap of stone on stone, the soft fading of a distant drum, and the quiet, steady fact that history can keep talking even when no one is raising their voice. A strange thing about architecture is that it can speak without moving. A wall says, stop, even when nobody is watching it. A gate says, not now, even when the city is asleep. And sometimes, rarely, and rather grimly, a tower can say, remember, in a way that doesn't require any letters at all. If your room is quiet, let it stay that way. Let the quiet do its job. Somewhere far from you, a desert wind combs dust the way a careful hand combs hair. A distant drum fades in and out like it's practicing being forgotten. And a patient tapping sound stone against stone keeps time so slowly it almost stops being time. Before we get too comfortable, just a small whisper, like a question asked into a sleeve. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? You don't have to answer out loud. You can answer the ceiling. Or you can answer nobody, which is also traditional. Now, in the Timurid worldwide roads, big horizons, long caravans that look like they retrying to stretch across the earth, fear can travel like a commodity. It can go ahead of an army the way a rumor goes ahead of a conversation. Timur's campaigns moved fast, and the movement itself is almost not the interesting part. The uninteresting part is the real part, the after. The streets that go quiet, the doors that close. The way a city can feel as if it has been read, like a letter that was opened and then put back in the envelope with slightly less air inside it. People often imagine conquest as noise, but daily life notices the silence first. Silence behind the army, silence after the hoofbeats, silence in the market where the same stall is there, but the same seller is not. And silence is practical. Silence tells you what not to do without explaining why. There's a sleepy kind of logistics in this too. Armies don't only fight, they also eat, argue, count, and look for water. Roads are measured by how long a cartwheel survives them. Camps are measured by how quickly a fire can be made from whatever can be found. The boring details keep the grand stories upright, like beams under a roof. And the message that fear travels faster than soldiers is partly a message about transportation. A traveler arrives with a story. A merchant arrives with a story. A pilgrim arrives with a story, and pilgrims are famously committed to repeating things they heard from someone who heard it from someone else. In a world of roadside inns and shared bowls, the rumor can be the first scout. The landscape itself becomes the messenger because people begin to read the hills and crossroads as if they are sentences. And then there's the message everyone understood, which is where we gently lower our voice and keep our descriptions polite. Timur is associated in many chronicles and later retellings with towers built as warnings, structures that were not meant to be beautiful, not meant to be useful, and certainly not meant to be lived in. They were meant to be recognized. They were meant to be repeated in rumor. A warning that can be seen from a distance is efficient, like a signpost that doesn't bother with friendliness. It turns defeat into a public symbol, so that the next city hears the outcome before anyone has to negotiate. It is a kind of communication that does not require translation, which is, in a grim way, the point. If you re still awake by the time we finish talking about how medieval people manage their reputations, the way we manage our notifications, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Honestly, the most historically accurate response is to fall asleep halfway through and wake up later with no memory of how you got there. The odd part is how long a structure can keep speaking after the people who built it have already moved on. A tower stays when the camp is gone. The road dust settles. The army is somewhere else, being an army at someone else's expense. And the tower becomes an object that locals have to live next to, like a grim landmark. People have to decide how to talk about it, whether to point at it, whether to avoid pointing at it, which is also a form of pointing. In sleepy history, this is what fascinates me. Not the dramatic act itself, but the tedious afterlife of the act. Who cleans around it? Who tells children not to go near it? Who quietly changes the topic? Who pretends it isn't there while still taking a slightly different route just in case? And then terror becomes a system, which sounds dramatic, but systems are usually made of paperwork. A message needs an audience, and the Timurid world had many audiences. Merchants who trade in cloth and spice and information. Envoys who carry official phrases in their mouths, like sealed documents. Pilgrims who carry sacred intentions and also, inevitably, other people's business. The roadside inn is a small institution. Someone's horse is always thirsty. Someone's sandals are always wrong for the season. Someone is always insisting they only stopped for a minute. In that environment, stories sharpen as they travel. Many becomes countless. A warning becomes a tradition. A tactic becomes a personality. And soon the tale outruns the truth, because truth is slow and rumor is light. Scribes help too in their quiet way. Not necessarily because they invent things, but because they normalize counting. Once something is written down, it looks official, even if it began as a guess. Numbers in chronicles can behave like coins. They circulate, they get clipped, they get inflated, and they still buy belief. A scribe might write with the calm confidence of someone who has never met a fact they couldn't tidy up. So many again, so many beyond count. Sometimes a number is less a measurement and more a mood. And fear doesn't require perfect accuracy. Fear requires consistency. Fear likes the same story told the same way, with the same sharp edges, until it feels like the only shape the world can take. If you want a micro hook that is almost too mild to qualify, consider this. Even in the middle of grand imperial movement, someone is always doing arithmetic badly by lamplight. Someone is always arguing over whether a date is correct. Someone is always wondering if the ink will last. History is built on little disputes that never make it into the heroic version. Somewhere in an office-like room that smells of dust and tired reed pens, a person is deciding whether to write 3 days or 4, and that decision might travel farther than they ever will. There's also the quieter lover of mercy, which is not a mood, not a soft feeling, but a tool. Terror works best when paired with selective restraint, because contrast makes people obedient. If every outcome is equally terrible, then the mind stops calculating and simply collapses. But if there is a choice, submit and be spared, resist and become an example, then fear becomes a kind of negotiation. It becomes a menu with only 2 items, and both are expensive, but one is still cheaper. An empire can offer that choice like a merchant offers 2 grades of cloth, one rough and one slightly less rough, and pretend the customer is empowered. This is where the boring logic creeps in. The gates open not because people love being ruled, but because they can do the math. The city thinks about its granaries, its children, its walls. It thinks about how long a siege lasts and how quickly hunger ruins pride. And the terrifying brilliance of a public warning is that it makes this calculation feel immediate. You don't have to imagine what might happen. You are invited quietly, forcefully, to imagine what already did. It turns future risk into visible memory, and memory is persuasive in the way a locked door is persuasive. It doesn't argue. It just stays locked. Now we shift softly into what these towers do inside the mind at night, because that's where you are anyway, half in your room. Half in whatever your brain decides to picture when it hears the word horizon. Imagine being a traveler who sees an outline in the distance before hearing the name of the city. You slow your horse. You lower your voice, even though there is no rule that says the landscape can hear you. Your posture changes. Your caution becomes a habit. Even if you never touch the place, it changes your behavior the way a do not enter sign changes your feet. You start choosing safer roads. You begin to prefer daylight. You stop staying late at inns that feel too talkative. The structure does its work without needing any new violence, which is part of what makes it so effective and so bleakly boring in a system sense. The message is outsourced to the object. The object stands there and repeats itself. And because people are people, they build rituals around avoidance. They tell each other what not to look at. They create polite phrases. They turn the unspeakable into a shorthand. You know, that place, the warning. Language becomes a blanket thrown over something sharp. Children grow up learning the geography of fear without being told directly that they are learning it. A parent steers a child's hand away from pointing. A guide coughs and changes the subject. A merchant offers a joke that is not funny, just useful. Well, he says, at least you can't miss it. The humor is thin, but thin humor is often what people have. And then there is what it does to the story of Timur himself, which is, again, less about emotion and more about narrative mechanics. To admirers, he becomes inevitable, a ruler whose will shapes geography the way a hard tool shapes wood. To victims and rivals, he becomes a lesson in what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both views feed the same machine, a reputation so heavy it starts to function like an army of its own. Once a reputation becomes architecture, once it can be pointed to, measured, described, it becomes difficult to dismantle. Because how do you argue with a thing that stands there? How do you negotiate with a landmark? How do you rewrite a story that has a silhouette? There's also the quieter truth that every empire, even one famous for fear, depends on ordinary administration. Roads have to be maintained enough to carry carts. Taxes have to be collected enough to fund movement. Messengers have to be fed. Horses have to be replaced. A court has to sit somewhere and pretend it is calm. Even a terrifying ruler has meetings. Even a terrifying campaign has delays. Somewhere, in a tent or a borrowed palace room, someone is misplacing a seal and someone else is pretending not to notice. The world is held together by small acts of organization, and terror often rides on top of that organization like an extra layer of paint. We drift now into the problem of numbers and memory, because centuries later the chronicles disagree on details. How often? How many? Where exactly? Because terror distorts record-keeping the way smoke distorts a room. Some accounts sharpen to shock, some soften to defend, some mix politics with eyewitness fragments, until it becomes impossible to separate what happened from what people wanted to believe happened. And yet the core pattern still matters for your sleepy brain. Script becomes policy, spectacle becomes communication, and numbers become props in a story that needs to feel large in order to do its job. History here is not only what happened, it is what people were trained to believe could happen, which is a subtler and more durable kind of influence. If you ever want to see how this works in modern life, you can think of how a single headline can grow legs and wander through the internet, changing shape, becoming more confident as it goes. But keep that analogy gentle, keep it dim. In the Timurid world, the internet is a chain of ins and markets and prayers muttered under breath. The share button is simply a person who cannot resist repeating something alarming. The algorithm is the human preference for stories that feel like warnings. And the comment section is, as always, the people near the water source. So let's end with a bedtime oath for heavy subjects, because you deserve softness even when the topic is not soft. Hold the scene at a distance, moonlight on stone, waned over empty ground, a warning that doesn't need to shout. Let the story stay calm, because calm can feel more unsettling than gore ever could, and we are not here for gore anyway. We are here for the slow, dull machinery of how fear becomes routine, how rumor becomes infrastructure, how a road becomes a lesson. If you end softly, end on the human detail. A traveler choosing silence, a city choosing surrender, a messenger choosing safer routes, a scribe choosing a number that will look good on the page. The night settles, the horizon blurs. The drum is only a memory of a sound. The stone taps slow down until they feel like your own heartbeat borrowing a rhythm. And somewhere far away in a place you do not have to visit the Empire's message, keep standing quiet, readable, and cold while you thankfully get to let your eyes close and leave history on the table like a book that can wait until morning. You might not expect a government to stare at a house and think very calmly, how many holes does it have? But here we are, in the gentle, slightly nosy world of the window tax, where daylight becomes a number, and a number becomes a bill. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the quiet keep its soft grip on the corners. Somewhere far away, rain is tapping a sill with the patience of a clerk who has found a rhythm. Somewhere else, a candle is being trimmed, not because it's dramatic, but because smoke is inconvenient. And in a city that smells faintly of coal and wet stone, someone is counting windows the way you might count sheep, slowly, repeatedly, and with no real joy. A whisper before we drift too far. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? You don't need to answer in full. A vague answer is historically appropriate. Most paperwork lives on vagueness. The window tax in its plainest form is an idea you could explain to a sleepy person in one sentence. The more windows you have, the more you pay. It is taxation by daylight. It assumes that windows are a luxury, like sugar or velvet, and that if you can't afford light, you can afford to share. It also assumes rather boldly that a window is a window, and that a government can recognize one when it sees it, which is where the whole thing starts to become quietly ridiculous, because a window is not just a window. A window is a rectangle of decisions. A window is glass, yes, but it is also a frame and putty and hinges and someone's opinion about drafts. A window is a place where cold enters politely. A window is where a neighbor's life leaks into your afternoon. And once a window becomes taxable, it becomes something else as well. A unit, a countable object. A little square that can be turned into a figure on a page. Imagine the assessor walking down a street with a small notebook, trying to look official without looking too interested. He is not there to judge your curtains. He is not there to comment on your taste. He is there to count openings in your wall, which is a strangely intimate job when you think about it for more than a moment. And because it is intimate, people respond the way people often do to intimacy from strangers, with creative avoidance. This is where the first sleepy absurdity arrives. If you tax windows, you will eventually meet someone who has decided that darkness is cheaper. Not romantic darkness. Not candlelit poetry darkness. Practical darkness. The kind of darkness that smells faintly of damp and makes you bump into furniture you have owned for years. People bricked up windows. They filled them in, neatly or not so neatly, depending on how much they cared about appearances. Some did it with a kind of resigned elegance, as if saying, yes, I will live like this, and yes, I will complain quietly, and yes, I will still pay the tax on the remaining ones. If you We're still awake in a few minutes, somewhere around the part where we start talking about the architectural equivalent of pretending not to be home. Feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The window tax would probably prefer you to subscribe to fewer things anyway. Fewer subscriptions, fewer windows. Fewer openings through which the world can charge you. Now, the counting itself becomes a tiny ritual. Street by street, house by house, you get a landscape of numbers. Some houses are proud of their light. Some houses are shy. Some houses are performing innocence. And a house can perform innocence in many ways, but one of the most soothingly petty ways is by turning a window into a suggestion rather than a fact. Because once people realize windows are being counted, they start asking questions like sleepy philosophers. What counts as a window? What if it's very small? What if it's high up? What if it's blocked by a wardrobe? What if it has been bricked in but still looks like a window from the outside? Because the facade likes symmetry. What if it's a blind window, a fake window, painted on or framed out so the building looks balanced? The tax does not only create revenue, it creates debates that could lull an insomniac into a peaceful silence. And you begin to notice something gentle and strange about old streets. Some of them look as if they were designed by someone who hated unevenness. Rows of Georgian facades, for example, often hold on to symmetry like a comfort blanket. A window here, a window there, evenly spaced, like calm breathing. So when windows become expensive, you don't always remove them aesthetically. You remove them financially, but you keep their ghost on the outside. You brick them up behind the facade. You keep the outline. You keep the illusion of a well-lit life, even when the inside is darker. There is a kind of soft humor in that. It is like paying for an app and then hiding the features from yourself to avoid temptation. The outside remains premium. The inside becomes basic, and the house does not announce this. The house simply continues being a house, while the people inside develop a close relationship with candles and the specific personality of damp air. When a tax turns into a habit, it also turns into a profession. The people who measure light become part of the background, like chimney sweeps, like lamplighters, like anyone whose work is both necessary and slightly resented. Assessors have to be consistent because consistency is what makes a system feel real. If one assessor counts a small attic window and another ignores it, the street starts to whisper. Whispering is how communities do accounting when they don't trust official numbers. And the assessor is not only counting, he is also quietly judging. Not judging you as a person, perhaps, but judging the intent of your architecture. Did you brick that up last week? Is that a window pretending not to be a window? Is that a skylight trying to live a private life? People become inventive in the same way they become inventive with any rule. They read it closely, they look for gaps, and they tell their friends. A tax produces its own folklore, and a folklore produces its own small acts of rebellion. You can imagine, if you like, a landlord standing in a hallway, speaking in the slow, careful tone of someone explaining why a sad thing is just how it is. He will say the tax is unavoidable. He will say it's only reasonable. He will say that if the tenant wants more light, that would be lovely, but it would also be more expensive, and therefore the tenant should consider learning to love shadows. Meanwhile, the tenant learns what every tenant learns. The building's flaws are apparently a feature of the era. And so the negotiations begin. Not dramatic negotiations, tiny ones. The kind that happen over cups of tea that have gone lukewarm. Could we open that window again? Not unless you want the rent to change. Could we at least unblock it in summer? Summer still has taxes. And somewhere in this, someone starts to understand that systems don't need to be loud to control behavior. They only need to be unavoidable. A window tax does not chase you down the street. It just sits quietly on your bill and waits. There are other sleepy details that gather around it. Glass itself, for instance, is not always cheap, not always perfect, not always clear. Earlier glass can ripple and distort, turning your neighbor into a moving watercolor. Windows can be patched, panes can be replaced one by one like teeth. And then, on top of the cost of glass, the cost of having the opening at all becomes a separate cost, which is a very modern kind of feeling. You pay for the object, you pay for the permission to have the object, and then you pay again because the object reminds the world you exist. This is also where the micro-absurdity turns slightly domestic. People rearrange furniture because the room is darker now. People place mirrors to steal light from whatever window remains. People use pale paint not because they love it, but because it reflects what little daylight makes it through. This is home improvement as quiet survival, and it is so unglamorous that it becomes soothing in a strange way to think about. The history of sleep is often the history of how people adapted to mild discomfort. Now we drift into the side effects because no policy stays in its lane. The window tax is about money, but it touches air. It touches health. It touches mood, even if we keep our tone calm. When you block windows, you block ventilation. Damp becomes a roommate. Smoke from fires and candles lingers longer. Rooms become warmer in summer in an unhelpful way, and colder in winter in a way that feels personal. You learn the smell of a room that cannot breathe. You learn the difference between fresh air and air that has been used too much. And this is where you might hear the softest possible irony. The tax that treats windows as a luxury encouraged some people to live with less light and less air, which makes their living conditions worse, which makes life harder, which makes everything more tiring. It is not a thrilling chain of events. It is not a heroic tragedy. It is just the slow, boring consequence of making an opening expensive. Yet the system also creates a curious kind of visual language. Walk down certain streets and you see bricked up rectangles like quiet secrets. They are architectural silences. They say, without speaking, that someone made a choice. Or was forced into one. Sometimes the bricks match. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the filled-in space looks like a repaired wound. Sometimes it looks like a carefully hidden cost-cutting measure, like putting a blanket over a stain. And then there are the houses that keep their symmetry with fake windows. This is perhaps the gentlest punchline of the whole thing. A building wants to look balanced. Society wants the building to look balanced. The building, therefore, pretends to have windows that do not exist. It is the architectural version of drawing pockets onto clothing. It looks right. It feels right. It provides no function. And it is very comforting to think of people caring that much about appearances while living in a room that might be slightly too dark to read in. You can also see how the tax maps onto class in a way that is almost too tidy. Bigger houses have more windows. More windows means more tax. So the wealthy pay more, which sounds fair if you say it quickly. But the wealthy also have more ways to pay. They have more ways to structure property. More ability to absorb cost. Meanwhile, those who are not wealthy might live in crowded buildings where the few windows are shared by many, making each window feel like a communal resource. Light becomes a kind of crowded public good, and the tax feels less like a punishment for luxury and more like a punishment for existing indoors. People also start to treat windows as status symbols in a new way. Not just, I have light, but I can afford to have light. It's an odd thing to display, because it's also a display to the taxman. But humans are very good at performing wealth, even when it comes with inconvenience. Someone might keep more windows open than they strictly need, because the point is not comfort, it's message. The house says, I do not fear your counting, which is a slightly strange thing for a house to say. But houses often speak through the people who pay for them. Centuries later, when people try to remember the policy, memory does what memory does. It smooths. It turns the complicated parts into a single phrase. It turns a specific tax with specific rules into a general feeling, They tax the light, and then folklore begins to attach itself like dust to old furniture. People love to explain modern phrases through dramatic origins. You may hear claims about daylight robbery, for instance, as if language itself is keeping a receipt from the 18th century. Sometimes those stories are tidy, sometimes they are wrong, but tidy wrong stories are extremely popular because they let the mind feel finished. And the chroniclers of everyday life letters, diaries, complaints that never intended to be literature carry the quieter truth. People grumble, people adjust, people forget the original rules but remember the irritation. The system becomes part of the background. You pay it the way you pay for things you cannot change. And then one day it ends, not with a dramatic curtain drop, but with the slow administrative motion of repeal. Laws often leave the way they arrive, through paperwork. What remains is the architecture. The bricked-up windows remain. The fake windows remain. The streets carry the old numbers in their faces. And if you know what you're looking at, you can see the policy still there, like a faint watermark. It is a reminder that governments can write themselves onto buildings, and that buildings can keep the ink long after the law has faded. So, as we drift toward a soft ending, keep the images gentle. Picture a quiet street at dusk. The lamps are on. The air is cool. A house stands with a row of windows that look evenly spaced, even though one of them is only pretending. Inside, someone sets down a ledger. Not a dramatic ledger, just a book of small numbers. Someone blows out a candle because wax is also a budget. Someone moves a chair closer to the one window that remains open to the sky, because everyone in every century will rearrange their life around whatever light they can get. Let the story end without a conclusion, because bedtime history doesn't need a moral. It just needs a steady rhythm. Windows counted, windows blocked, windows remembered, rain on stone, a pencil scratching, a clerk folding paper, and you in your own room with your own quiet, letting your thoughts dim the way a candle dims when it's finally allowed to rest. You might not expect an empire to leave behind a message that cannot be folded, cannot be sealed with wax, and cannot be politely ignored. But in the Timurid world, sometimes the message was not written on paper at all. Sometimes it was built. It stood where roads meet, it waited in the dust, and it did not require you to be literate. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the silence do its quiet work. Imagine, far from you, a desert wind combing through loose sand with the patience of a brush. A distant drum fades, not with drama, but with distance. And somewhere a stone taps another stone in a slow, almost thoughtful rhythm, like someone counting time with their fingertips because clocks are expensive and sleep is free. Before we drift deeper, a whisper, soft and unhurried. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? A vague answer is fine. Empires, too, often preferred vague answers. In Timur's campaigns, movement is fast, but what lingers is the slow aftermath, not the heroic kind. The administrative kind, the quiet where a city's daily sounds used to be, a gate that stays closed longer than usual, a market that opens with fewer voices, roads that feel wider when fewer people use them. Even if you never see the army itself, you can feel the way it rearranges the world, like a heavy piece of furniture dragged across a room. And then, once the dragging stops, the floor has marks. In that kind of landscape, fear travels ahead of soldiers. Not because fear is brave, but because fear is efficient. Merchants carry it. Pilgrims carry it. Envoys carry it in the polite way they choose their words. Even animals carry it, in a sense, because animals notice when humans are too quiet. An empire does not only conquer with horses and steel, it also conquers with expectation. The belief that resistance has a price, and that the price will be displayed somewhere public, like a notice posted on a wall. This is where the towers enter the conversation, not as art, not as architecture you admire up close, but as a kind of sign. A structure meant to be recognized from a distance. It is important for sleep to keep it at a distance. We don't need to stare. We don't need details. The point is the idea that a ruler can make a warning so visible it becomes part of geography, like a hill, like a landmark, like an unfortunate monument that no one asked for, yet everyone learns to navigate around. And there is something quietly modern about that, in the worst possible way, because it treats attention like a resource. If you can control what people imagine before they arrive, you control what they do when they arrive. The message is not the structure itself, really. The message is the thought it produces inside the traveler's head. The traveler sees something on the horizon and becomes a person who negotiates differently. That is the whole point. The structure does work without needing to move. If you are still awake by the time I reach the part where a rumor becomes a kind of unpaid employee of the state, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Empires demanded effort. Bedtime history does not have to. Now, when people talk about these towers, numbers start to appear. Numbers are very comforting to the human mind, even when they describe uncomfortable things. Numbers feel like control. They feel like accounting. They feel like someone somewhere has a ledger and is doing their job properly. But numbers also inflate in the telling because fear enjoys exaggeration. Fear likes to stretch a story the way heat stretches air over a road. Many becomes countless. A lot becomes the most. A rumor does not need perfect accuracy. It only needs consistency and repetition. It needs to be believable enough to be useful. So the Timurid message, whether it was described with careful counting or with dramatic inflation, functioned the same way. It said, consequences can be made visible. Consequences can be left behind. Consequences can be stacked into something you will remember when you are trying to decide whether to open a gate or keep it closed. And the cruel cleverness spoken quietly, without excitement, is that a structure can keep speaking long after the army rides on, long after the dust settles, long after the people who built it have gone back to being ordinary and tired. At a crossroads, a warning does not need to shout. It just needs to exist. Think of the way a simple road sign changes your behavior. You slow down, you check, you adjust. Now imagine a warning that does not tell you the speed limit, but tells you what happens when you refuse the limit. It changes the posture of a whole region. It makes people choose safer roads, quieter roads, roads that take longer but feel less risky. It makes trade routes bend slightly, the way rivers bend around rocks. And the bending itself becomes history, the slow reshaping of movement by fear. There's also, strangely, a bureaucracy hiding in this. Because terror, when it becomes a system, needs distribution. A message needs an audience, and an audience needs a network. You have merchants who stop at roadside inns and tell stories into the smoky air. You have scribes who write chronicles with their own loyalties and their own preferred adjectives. You have survivors who warn their children in the plain language of parents who want their children to live. You have rivals who repeat the story because it makes Timur look monstrous, and admirers who repeat the story because it makes him look unstoppable. Either way, the story travels. And as it travels, it sharpens. Not because anyone plans it perfectly, but because stories like sharpness. A blunt rumor is forgettable. A sharp rumor sticks. It becomes a lesson. It becomes a proverb without needing to be wise. The story begins to outrun the truth, which is a common talent of stories. And also, if we're being sleepy about it, a common flaw. In the Timurid world, the presence of travelers matters here. The routes are busy with movement, trade, pilgrimage, diplomacy, the slow migration of people seeking work or safety. Roadside inns become little laboratories of rumor. A man arrives, dusty, hungry, eager for soup. Someone asks casually, "How is the next city?" And the answer is rarely just about prices. It becomes about safety. It becomes about what can happen. The innkeeper listens. The stable boy listens, the woman pouring water listens, and by morning, the rumor has been copied into several minds without anyone paying a fee. You can almost picture the rumor as a physical thing, like a coin passed from hand to hand. It gets warmer as it travels. It picks up fingerprints. It loses detail in one place and gains detail in another. A scribe might put it into a chronicle with a tone of disapproval or awe, depending on what kind of career the scribe hopes to have. An envoy might mention it carefully in a letter, choosing words that do not sound panicked but still communicate urgency. A merchant might use it as leverage. We should take the longer route because I heard. And suddenly, a story is shaping a map. Now we come to something that sounds like mercy but behaves like a tool. Selective mercy. This is one of the quiet engines of terror systems, because terror works best, oddly, when it is not constant. Constant terror becomes noise. People adapt. People numb out. That terror paired with mercy creates contrast, and contrast creates obedience. One city resists and becomes an example. Another submits and is spared, and that memory becomes a bargain you can point to. Look, the story says, submission works. The message is not only punishment, it is negotiation. And negotiation for bedtime purposes is much more boring than battle. Negotiation is a gate kept closed while people talk. It is a council arguing late into the night with tired eyes and cold tea. It is someone asking, what are the terms? It is someone else asking, what happens if we refuse? And the answer is rarely philosophical. It is often practical. It is about survival logic. Open the gate now or gamble with your future. A system of fear does not need to be emotional. It only needs to be predictable enough to be used. This is where the message becomes a kind of policy, not written as law, not debated in a calm assembly, but understood. It becomes part of the mental furniture of the region. People internalize it. They don't think every day, I fear the tower. They think instead, I should not be the city that becomes the lesson. And that thought shapes behavior without requiring constant force. A reputation becomes an army of its own, marching ahead in the quiet spaces between towns. Now, imagine being a traveler in this landscape. You see the outline on the horizon before you hear the name of the city. You slow your horse, not because anyone tells you to, but because your body does it before your mind catches up. You lower your voice. Suddenly, every sound feels louder than it should: hoofbeats, leather creaking, a swallow of water. Even if you never go near the thing, it changes you. It makes you cautious. It makes you agreeable. It makes you careful about what you say in public, which is the simplest form of control, making people edit themselves. And it's not only travelers. It's also the people who live nearby. They learn to live with the knowledge that their region has a landmark of consequence. They raise children with warnings in their tone. They choose their arguments carefully. They pay attention to politics not because they enjoy politics, but because politics has teeth. And the daily life becomes procedural in the same way fear always makes daily life procedural. Who speaks first? Who bows first? Who offers what? Who keeps quiet? It's like living in a house where you know the floor creaks, so you learn exactly where to step. What does this do to the story of Timur himself? It splits it, which is also a boring and reliable human habit. To admirers, he becomes inevitable, a ruler whose will shapes geography and history like a hard tool, a person who does not just win, but redesigns the idea of winning. To victims and rivals, he becomes a lesson in what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both sides feed the same machine, reputation. And once reputation becomes something you can point at on the horizon, it becomes very difficult to dismantle, because dismantling a reputation is harder than dismantling a wall. A wall is bricks. A reputation is mines. There's a gentle irony here if we keep it quiet. The very thing that makes the system work, its visibility, also guarantees it will be argued about forever. People will disagree on details. They will disagree on numbers. They will disagree on how often, how many, and where exactly. Chroniclers will sharpen to shock. Others will soften to defend. Some will mix politics with eyewitness fragments, the way a cook mixes whatever is left in the pantry into a stew. And centuries later, someone will still be trying to decide which account feels most reliable, as if reliability is a clean object you can hold. This brings us to the problem of memory. Memory, especially collective memory, loves extremes. It loves clear villains. It loves clear heroes. It loves clean numbers. But terror distorts record keeping because terror changes what people are willing to write down. A scribe may choose safer language. A witness may choose silence. An official may exaggerate because exaggeration is useful. A rival may exaggerate because exaggeration is insulting. And in the middle of all that, the ordinary truth becomes hard to see, like a small stone at the bottom of muddy water. So history here is not only what happened, it is what people were trained to believe could happen. That difference matters because belief shapes decisions, and decisions shape outcomes. If a city believes resistance is hopeless, it may not resist. If it does not resist, the conqueror wins more easily. If the conqueror wins more easily, the reputation grows. And the reputation then becomes proof of itself, which is a very efficient loop, and also a very tiring one if you're on the wrong side of it. And yet, if we are keeping this as bedtime history, we can let the heavy subject stay at a respectful distance. We can let it be a lesson about systems rather than a gallery of suffering. We can keep our eyes on the quiet mechanics. Fear as infrastructure, rumor as transport, mercy as leverage, memory as distortion. These are not exciting topics. They are the slow gears behind excitement. They are the parts most people skip, which is perfect for sleep. So let's end with a small human image, because humans are easier to hold gently than empires. Picture a traveler at night choosing a safer road. Not because the road is beautiful, not because the traveler loves long journeys, just because the traveler prefers predictable discomfort to unpredictable danger. The traveler stops at an inn. The inn smells of wood smoke and boiled grain. Someone asks where the traveler came from. The traveler answers vaguely. Someone asks where the traveler is going. The traveler answers even more vaguely. A story is mentioned softly, like a warning passed under a door. Outside, the wind keeps combing the dust. Inside, a candle burns low because wax is also a kind of budget. Somewhere, stones tap together in a patient rhythm. And in the far distance, a message stands in the landscape, quiet, readable, and cold, doing its work without moving. While the night settles and the horizon blurs and your own thoughts, safely far away, are allowed to dim until they become as light as drifting sand. You might not expect the most powerful force in a medieval monastery to be a candle, not a relic, not a sermon, not even a particularly impressive bell, just a quiet, stubborn stick of wax that insists on being counted, measured, and, if possible, not wasted by brother whoever you are. And yet, in a place devoted to prayer, candles were basically the electricity bill. The timekeeper, the mood lighting, and the emergency plan all rolled into one slow-burning problem. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the dark be useful. Imagine a stone corridor that holds cool air like a secret. Somewhere, a soft scrape of a key in a lock. A wooden door opens with the tired sigh of old hinges. Wax smells faintly sweet. Tallow smells faintly like someone tried their best. And a single flame makes a small circle of light that looks confident for about 3 seconds. Before you remember how large a building can be, a whisper, while we're here. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You don't have to answer precisely. Medieval record-keeping loved precision that humans rarely do, especially at night. Now, picture the monastery storeroom. It's not the romantic kind of room where manuscripts glow and everyone looks wise. It's the practical kind. Shelves, bundles, boxes. A place where things are weighed and guarded because if you don't guard them, someone will borrow them for reasons that feel holy in the moment. Candles sit here like quiet soldiers waiting to be deployed into darkness. Beeswax candles, if the house is wealthy enough, are the luxury version, cleaner, brighter, with a scent that almost suggests optimism. Tallow candles are the budget option made from rendered animal fat, and they burn with the determined energy of something that knows it was not invited to be fancy. And because candles are expensive in the way boring necessities are always expensive, monasteries did what humans always do when something is expensive. They organized it. They assigned someone to be responsible. They created rules. They created guilt. Somewhere in this system is a monk whose entire spiritual journey includes the phrase, "Who used the good candles for that?" There were roles for this. A cellarer, for example, was the person in charge of supplies, which sounds calm until you realize it includes food, drink, tools, repairs, and anything else that prevents daily life from collapsing. In some houses, a sacristan handled church items, including wax for liturgical use. And whoever was in charge of candles learned something simple. A candle is not just a candle. It is a resource. It is time. It is control over the night. It is the difference between reading a line correctly and guessing and hoping God appreciates your creativity. If you're still awake by the time we reach the thrilling topic of wick length as a budget category, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I won't chase you through a cloister. I don't have the footwear for it. Now the first quiet scene of candle life is distribution. Who gets light and when? Monasteries had schedules because schedules are the closest thing to a personality some institutions ever develop. The day begins early, very early. You wake in darkness for nocturnal prayers, and you need light too. Get from bed to church without discovering every stone edge with your shin. A candle, then, is not romantic. It is injury prevention. It is also a way to make sure people actually show up, because it's harder to sneak away when someone can see you trying dot, so candles are issued, not casually, with awareness. Some houses had rules about how many candles could be used in certain spaces or at certain times. A single candle might be assigned to a reader. Several might be reserved for the choir. The church itself is a large mouth of darkness that needs multiple flames just to become navigable. And then there are private uses, which are always the problem. A monk with a book might want just a little more light, which is a phrase that has probably caused budget stress in every era, just in different forms. A monk with a letter, a monk with a headache, a monk with a creative project he insists is spiritually necessary. Asterisk, but in a community that values obedience, light becomes a quiet test. If candles are controlled, then night behavior is controlled. You can't easily do forbidden things in the dark if you can't get light without asking. The candle is, in a gentle way, a permission slip. And permission slips can be denied. Now we drift into the second scene, the ledger. Because if you can count something, you can argue about it. And medieval people loved arguing about things they could count, especially if the argument was disguised as moral seriousness. Wax came in weights, candles came in sizes. A certain number of pounds of wax could be turned into a certain number of candles. A certain number of candles could be consumed per week. A certain amount of consumption could be judged as reasonable or suspicious, depending on how much the person judging you likes you. The sacred calendar also mattered. Big feast days require more light. Special services require more candles. Processions require portable flames that don't embarrass you by going out halfway down the aisle. So the monastery has to plan. It has to store wax. It has to make candles or buy them. If they make them, someone is melting wax, dipping wicks, repeating the same motion until the candle becomes thick enough to stand on its own. It's repetitive, which is ideal for monastic life and also ideal for falling asleep because repetition is basically the brain's lullaby. And then, of course, there's theft, not dramatic theft, the soft kind. The I took one candle because I needed to read something important kind. The candle that disappears and no one admits it because everyone is a little too peaceful to accuse anyone directly. But the ledger notices. The ledger always notices. The ledger is the least forgiving monk in the building. There are even wonderfully boring arguments about quality. Beeswax candles burn cleaner and longer. Tallow candles can smoke and smell. Smoke blackens walls and ceilings, which means cleaning, which means work, which means someone is unhappy. So using the wrong candle in the wrong place becomes a chain reaction of tedious consequences. A candle choice can lead to a wall being scrubbed. It's almost poetic in a deeply unpoetic way. One wick today, extra labor tomorrow. Now we shift slowly into the third scene, enforcement. This is where the monastery's gentlest form of surveillance appears. Not spies in cloaks, just routines. Someone walks the storeroom, someone checks the church. Someone notices if a candle is burning too long in a side chapel when no one is present. Someone notices if a dormitory has more light than it should at that hour. Light becomes a signal. A bright corridor at midnight is basically an announcement that someone is awake and doing something, which might be fine, or might be suspicious, or might simply be annoying. Rules could be specific. In some communities, reading at night might be limited. In others, extra light might be allowed only with permission. Some monasteries were strict about private property, which includes private candles. You don't want monks stockpiling wax like it's a personal treasure, because personal treasure is the seed of personal ambition, and personal ambition is the seed of paperwork, endless paperwork, and probably a stern conversation with the abbot. The abbot, by the way, is not just a spiritual leader. He is also quietly the person who has to care that the monastery can afford winter. Candles matter more in winter. Nights are longer. Cold makes wax behave differently. Damp air makes everything harder. So when someone uses too many candles, it is not only waste, it is future darkness. It is a budget problem that arrives months later like a slow, predictable punishment. There were also symbolic layers, which is the monastery's specialty. Light represents knowledge. Light represents God. Light represents vigilance. And this is where the comedy becomes gentle. You can make a spiritually serious argument about why you needed 3 candles, and someone can reply with an equally spiritually serious argument about why you should learn humility in the dark. Both sides will sound wise. Both sides are, in practice, negotiating over wax. Even the wick becomes a topic. Wicks must be trimmed. A wick too long makes smoke. A wick too short makes a weak flame. So someone is trimming wicks and feeling morally responsible while doing it, because monasteries have that talent, turning maintenance into virtue. Imagine a man in a quiet corner carefully trimming a wick and thinking, this too is discipline. He's not entirely wrong. He's also not entirely awake. And because this is a system, it trains behavior. People learn to move carefully in low light. They learn the feel of familiar corridors. They learn to avoid unnecessary trips at night, because every trip requires light, and every light requires wax, and every wax requires explanation. The monastery night becomes a controlled environment, like a library with strict hours and one overworked staff member who knows exactly who returned a book late last week. Now we drift into the fourth and final scene, what this leaves behind. Not a grand conclusion, just residue, wax strips, Smoke marks. The quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, is always counting. Over years, the ceilings darkened near the places where candles burned most. You could almost read the monastery's habits and its soot patterns like a boring map of devotion. Here is where the choir stood. Here is where the reader used extra light. Here is where someone lingered with a candle and a thought they didn't want to let go of. And centuries later, historians find records, inventories, accounts of wax purchased, notes about donations of candles, complaints about shortages, the sorts of documents that make modern people yawn, which is why they are perfect for this series. Because in those records, you can see daily life not as drama, but as management. You can see how spirituality lived alongside budgeting, how prayer lived alongside supply chains, how a community that wanted to think about eternity still had to think about whether the candle supply would last until Easter. There's also a soft modern analogy here if you let it be subtle. Replace wax with electricity. Replace the cellarer with someone managing a monthly bill. Replace the abbot's concern with a household trying to be careful in winter. The technology changes. The feeling doesn't. Darkness demands payment, one way or another dot, so let the image fade gently. A monastery corridor. A candle in a hand. Footsteps that try to be quiet because quiet is the default language here. The flame leans slightly with each movement as if it is tired too. Somewhere behind a door, another monk is asleep, unaware that a small administrative universe is moving through the hallway in the form of one candle and one set of rules. The night settles. The storeroom remains locked. The ledger waits for morning, patient as stone, and the candle, doing its tiny job, burns down without urgency, leaving a thin trail of wax as proof that time passed. Someone walked, someone needed light, and then eventually no one needed anything at all for a while, because sleep arrived the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. You might not expect a building to be used as a sentence the way a letter is used as a sentence, but Timur seemed to enjoy the idea that stone could speak when people were too frightened to. Not in a poetic way, more in the way a road sign speaks. You don't have to like it, but you do have to read it, because you're already traveling in that direction. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the quiet do its slow work. Imagine that desert wind combing dust the way fingers comb hair, patiently, without a goal. A distant drum fades until it becomes almost imaginary. And then, very close, a steady soundstone tapping stone in a rhythm so calm it could be mistaken for someone practicing patience. A whisper. Before we go any further, where are you listening from and what time is it there? You can answer in your head or not at all. In the Timurid world, people answered questions even when nobody asked them, because rumor was always listening. Now, picture the aftermath that doesn't get painted on the heroic murals. Timur's campaigns move fast in the way storms move fast, and then the sky clears and the real story becomes the quiet after. Emptied streets, sealed gates, the feeling that a city has been read like a page turned too quickly. Even when nobody is shouting anymore, the silence has a shape, and it sits in doorways and marketplaces as if it paid rent. This is where the landscape becomes part of the message. Roads aren't only lines between cities. They are nerves. They carry supplies, merchants, pilgrims, gossip, complaints, and the very human habit of saying, I heard something, and then making it larger so the listener stays close. Fear travels farther than soldiers because fear doesn't need hay or rest or a budget. It just needs someone to repeat it with the right expression. And you can imagine a traveler noticing small changes before the big ones. Fewer carts, inns that close early, a man who speaks softer than usual, as if volume is an expensive resource, A roadside shrine with offerings left in a hurry. A gatekeeper who looks over your shoulder too often, as if the horizon is a debt collector, if you're still awake by the time we start talking about the mathematics of intimidation. Yes, there's math. Feel free to subscribe. Or don't, it's fine. Timur would have preferred your loyalty, but I'll accept your drowsiness. Somewhere ahead, the story says there are towers. And in the way medieval stories work, the towers are never just towers. They are public punctuation. They are a statement you can see from far away, which is important, because distance is part of the design. A message that must be read up close is too intimate. A message that can be read from a mile away is efficient. And efficiency is a kind of power that rarely sleeps. Now, let's be careful and calm with what comes next, because the subject is heavy and it doesn't need decoration. Many chronicles and later retellings describe towers of skulls, associated with Timur's conquest as structures meant to intimidate, meant to stand after the army moved on, meant to make the next city feel the outcome before any negotiation even begins. The details vary. The numbers vary wildly. The places vary depending on who is writing and why. But the point of the story stays stubbornly consistent: visible consequence, visible control, and there's a cold cleverness to that in an administrative way. If your power can remain present after you leave, you don't have to spend as much energy returning. You don't have to fight every day. You only have to be unavoidable. The tower becomes the employee who keeps doing the job after the manager goes. Home except the manager is a conquering empire, and the job is remind everyone what happens when you resist. The towers, if we treat them as a message, are also oddly bureaucratic. A message needs clarity. It needs repetition. It needs a recognizable style. It needs to be something people can describe to each other without getting lost in the details. In a sense, it's like branding, except nobody is trying to sell you soap. They are selling you obedience, and the marketing budget is not pleasant. And yet the story's power isn't only in what the towers are. It's in what they do to conversation. Because once you believe a structure like that exists, you don't need to see it yourself. You just need to imagine it. Your imagination will do the labor for free. A rumor can build an entire tower in your mind without a single stone being lifted. Asterisk. So we drift into the system that makes a message travel. The scribes, the merchants, the pilgrims, the envoys, and the endless mouths of roadside inns. A caravanserai is basically an ancient internet forum, except with more camels and fewer profile pictures. Travelers arrive with dust on their clothes and stories in their throats. Someone asks casually, "How was the road?" And the answer becomes a performance, because every storyteller wants to be remembered, and fear is a sticky kind of memory. Scribes record. Enemies repeat. Survivors warn their children, and children turn warnings into legends because legends feel easier to carry than raw anxiety. Merchants sharpen details because drama makes a better sale, even when the sale is simply attention. And gradually, many becomes countless, because countless sounds more like fate. It sounds bigger than a human decision. The interesting thing is that fear does not require perfect accuracy. It requires consistency. If 3 different travelers tell you that resistance ends badly, you don't stop to ask for exact numbers. You just start planning routes that avoid the question entirely. Fear is a map-making tool. It redraws borders without ink. There's also a quiet arithmetic to it. If a city hears that another city resisted and suffered, and then hears that a different city submitted and was spared, the lesson becomes a simple equation. Obedience equals survival. That's not morality. That's policy. And policies are easier to follow when they look like math, because math sounds neutral even when it is, in single quotes, T dot, This is where selective mercy becomes part of the mechanism. It's not kindness, it's contrast. Contrast is persuasive. If every city is punished the same way, the punishment becomes noise. But if one city is destroyed and the next is spared, everyone starts trying to become the spared city. The Empire offers a choice that feels like logic: open the gate now, or gamble with your future. It's a negotiation tool disguised as inevitability, and it's quietly exhausting because now every community is forced into decision-making while already frightened. You can imagine councils meeting under low light, counting supplies, arguing about whether rumors are reliable, and then realizing that reliability is not the point. The point is what the rumor makes you do. The rumor itself is a lever. Now, let the scene shift again, gently, into the night mind, the private place where public messages do their longest work. Imagine being a traveler who sees the outline on the horizon before hearing the name of the city. You slow your horse. Your voice drops. Every sound feels louder than it should, like the world turned up the volume on small things. Even if you never touch the place, it changes your behavior, your posture, your caution, your willingness to argue with anyone about anything. You become polite in the way people become polite around storms. The structure, whether you see it or only believe it, does its work without requiring new violence. That's the disturbing efficiency of reputation. It is violence that has been turned into a memory and then into a habit. And habits are what systems really want. Systems don't want your feelings. Systems want your predictable actions. They want you to choose the safer road without being told. They want you to pay before being chased. They want you to surrender before the siege begins. Because surrender is cheaper for everyone except the part of you that wanted dignity. There's a strange, sleepy irony here. The message works best when it becomes boring. When people say, yes, that's Timur, with the tired resignation you might use for bad weather. When fear becomes routine, the world continues functioning under it. Trade continues. Taxes continue. People keep baking bread. They just bake it with slightly more caution and slightly fewer jokes. And then, slowly, the story of Timur becomes shaped by the same mechanism. To admirers, he becomes inevitable, a ruler whose power shapes geography and history like a hard tool. To victims and rivals, he becomes a lesson in what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both versions feed the machine, a reputation so heavy it becomes an army of its own. Once a reputation becomes architecture, it is difficult to dismantle. You can tear down a tower, but you can't easily tear down the idea of the tower once it has entered language. People will rebuild it in stories. They will rebuild it in warnings. They will rebuild it in the way parents tell children not to wander too far from the road. Now we arrive at the long after. When the horse hooves fade and the dust settles and the empire moves on, and centuries later, historians and chroniclers start arguing in the most human way possible about numbers. How often? How many? Where exactly? What is literal? What is exaggerated? What is propaganda? What is hostile reporting? What is defensive reporting? What is an eyewitness memory that got edited by time? This is where the records become strangely relatable, because the past is full of people insisting that they are being objective while standing in the middle of politics. Some accounts sharpen the story to shock. Some soften it to defend. Some mix it with other events. And the more powerful the figure, the more everyone's pen becomes a little bit biased. Because writing is never just writing. It is a claim dot, so you see the core pattern still matters. Terror as policy, spectacle as communication. But the details become slippery. One source gives one number. Another source gives another. A later writer repeats the most dramatic version because drama survives. And then modern readers, very far away, try to untangle it like someone untangling thread in dim light, squinting, unsure where the knot begins. And maybe that is the final quiet lesson for bedtime. History is not only what happened, it's also what people were trained to believe could happen. A rumor can be an event even if the numbers are wrong, because the rumor changes behavior, and behavior is real. If a city opens its gates because it fears a story, then the story has already become a kind of force dot, so hold the scene at a distance. Moonlight on stone, wind over empty ground, a warning that does not need to shout. Let the story stay calm, because calm is sometimes more unsettling than graphic detail ever could be. Let your mind keep the facts at arm's length, like a historian wearing careful gloves, because you don't need to touch everything to understand that it mattered. And if you end softly, end on the human detail. A traveler choosing silence, a city choosing surrender, a messenger choosing safer roads, a scribe dipping a pen, writing numbers that might be wrong, but feelings that are unfortunately accurate. The night settles, the horizon blurs, and the message keeps standing in the mind quiet, readable and cold until even that eventually turns into a distant shape, and then into a thought you don't have to hold anymore, because sleep, unlike empires, arrives without needing to be believed. You might not expect a conquest to leave behind something as quiet as architecture, but sometimes the loudest part of an army is the silence it teaches people to practice. A desert wind can do that too, in its own slow way, combing dust across stone like it has all night and nowhere to be. Far off, a drum that was once a real sound becomes a memory of a sound. Close in, a patient tapping stone against stone keeps, a rhythm that feels less like a warning and more like someone counting time because counting is calming. Before we drift too far, a small whisper of a question. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You can answer out loud if you want, or just let the answer float in your head like a label on a jar. In the Timurid world, labels mattered, names, places, the direction a traveler came from, the direction they planned to go next. Even when nobody wrote it down, someone usually remembered it, which is almost the same thing, except less organized. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the quiet do what it does best. Take sharp things and soften them at the edges. We're going to talk about a topic that people often tell in a loud voice, with dramatic numbers and heavy emphasis. But we're going to keep it gentle, because even heavy subjects can be handled like fragile objects carefully, without dropping them, without pretending they're not heavy. Imagine a road after an army has passed. Not the marching, not the banners, not the speeches. The after, the part that looks boring from a distance, which is exactly why it matters. A road where the wheel ruts are fresh and the grass is pressed down like it's been told to lie flat. A road where the ends are open but quieter than they should be, like everyone is trying not to attract attention from the sky itself. In places like this, you don't need a map to know you're entering someone's reach. You can feel it in the way doors close earlier, and in the way strangers stop asking friendly questions. Because friendly questions are a luxury, Timur's campaigns move fast, and speed is a kind of message too. Speed says, you don't have time to prepare. Speed says, your walls will still be thinking when I arrive. And then, after the speed, there's the pause. The emptied street, the sealed gate, the marketplace that has products but not much laughter. It's the feeling that a city has been read like a page quickly, firmly, and with no promise that the reader enjoyed it. Fear travels farther than soldiers. Soldiers have to eat. Fear just has to be repeated. It can ride on a merchant's tongue, on a pilgrim's sigh, on an envoy's carefully neutral phrasing. It can sit on the bench of a roadside inn and listen to everything, like an old man who isn't sleeping but also isn't admitting it. The landscape becomes part of the warning. Crossroads become punctuation marks. Even a distant silhouette can turn into a sentence. And then there's the thing people remember most, the towers. The phrase itself is heavy, and it tends to arrive with exaggerated numbers, because humans love drama, even when drama is bad for them. Many chronicles and later retellings describe towers of skulls connected to Timur's conquest of structures meant to intimidate, meant to remain after the army moved on, meant to speak to the next city before any negotiation begins. The details vary. The numbers vary wildly. The location changes depending on who is writing and what they want the story to do. But the underlying idea is stubborn, a visible consequence, placed where it can be seen. There's a cold kind of logic in making a message readable from far away. A message that must be read up close is personal. A message that can be read from a distance is administrative. It's like putting a policy notice on a door, except the policy notice is meant to sit in the mind like a weight. You don't need to touch it. You just need to imagine it, and your imagination will do the work for free, which is a very efficient business model if you ignore the morality completely. Asterisk, the towers and the stories are not built for beauty. They are built for recognition. They are meant to be repeated in rumor, because rumor is the real construction material. A stone structure can crumble, but a story can stay standing for centuries, especially if it frightens people in a simple, memorable way. And there's something grimly clever about leaving behind a structure that keeps speaking after the army rides on. It's the kind of customer service nobody asked for, but everyone receives anyway. Now we drift into the system that makes a message travel. The scribes, the merchants, the pilgrims, the envoys, and the endless mouths of roadside inns. A caravanserai is basically a medieval message board with better snacks and worse sanitation. Travelers arrive with dust on their clothes and a story ready to be traded for warmth. Someone says, casually, "How was the road?" And the answer becomes a performance, because fear is contagious and attention is addictive, even when it comes with a side of dread. Stories sharpen as they travel. Many becomes countless. I heard becomes I saw, because I saw sounds more valuable. People add details the way someone adds seasoning, not because the truth needs it, but because the listener stays awake a little longer when the story has texture. A scribe might write what he heard. A rival might repeat it louder. A survivor might warn their children, and children might turn warnings into legend because legend feels easier to carry than raw anxiety. And soon, the tale outruns the facts, but not necessarily the effects dot. The odd thing is that fear doesn't require perfect accuracy. It requires consistency. If 3 different travelers tell you resistance ends badly, you don't stop to verify the footnotes. You start choosing safer roads. You start watching the horizon more often. You start practicing politeness like it's a shield. Fear becomes a map-making tool, redrawing borders without ink, just by changing where people dare to walk. There's also arithmetic in it, the quiet kind. If one city resists and becomes an example, and another submits and is spared, the lesson becomes a simple equation: obey and survive. That's not morality, that's policy. And policy works best when it feels like math, because math looks neutral even when the outcome isn't. The Empire offers a choice that feels like survival logic. Open the gate now, or gamble with your future. It's negotiation disguised as inevitability. Selective mercy becomes part of the mechanism. Not because it's kind, but because contrast is persuasive. If every city suffers the same, the punishment becomes background noise. But if one city is crushed and the next is spared, everyone starts trying to become the spared city. Mercy turns into a lever, not a mood. It's a reminder that the system controls not only harm, but relief. And humans will do an exhausting amount of work for relief. Even when relief is offered like a coupon with invisible conditions, you can imagine councils meeting under low light, counting grain and arrows and the patience of their people. You can imagine the arguments that sound practical but are really fear wearing a sensible hat. Someone says, maybe the rumors are exaggerated, and someone else says, maybe, but what if they're not? And the room slowly realizes that exaggeration doesn't matter as much as the possibility, because possibility changes behavior. A rumor can be a weapon even if its numbers are wrong, because the rumor makes people move. Now let the scene shift gently into the night mind, the private place where public messages do their longest work. Imagine being a traveler who sees an outline on the horizon before hearing the name of the city. You slow your horse. Your voice drops. Even a small sound feels too sharp, like it could draw attention from the darkness. You don't argue with strangers. You don't bargain as aggressively. You become careful in a way that feels almost like etiquette, except the etiquette is built from caution, the structure. Whether you see it or only believe it exists, does its work without needing fresh violence. That's the efficiency of reputation. It becomes self-maintaining. It can turn a person into a polite shadow of themselves before any soldier is even nearby. And that's why systems love reputation. Systems don't need your feelings. Systems want your predictable actions. They want you to choose the safer road without being told. They want you to surrender before the siege begins, because surrender is cheaper for everyone, except the part of you that wanted dignity. There's a quiet irony in how fear becomes routine. Once a warning becomes familiar, people can live under it. Trade continues. Bread is still baked. Water is still carried. Someone still complains about the price of onions because history rarely cancels the price of onions. The world keeps functioning, only a little tighter, a little quieter, a little more cautious. The message becomes boring, and that is exactly when it becomes powerful, because boring things are stable. They don't require constant attention to remain true in your mind, and the story of Timur becomes shaped by the same mechanism. To admirers, he becomes inevitable, a ruler whose power shapes geography and memory like a heavy tool. To victims and rivals, he becomes a lesson, what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both versions feed the machine. A reputation so large it behaves like an army of its own, arriving ahead of the horses, setting up camp inside your imagination. Once reputation becomes architecture, it's hard to dismantle. You can tear down a tower, but you can't easily tear down the thought of the tower once it has entered language. People rebuild it in stories. They rebuild it in warnings. They rebuild it in the way parents tell children not to wander too far from the road. And even people who doubt the literal details may still feel the emotional weight, because doubt is slow and fear is fast. Now we drift into the long after, when hooves have faded and dust has settled, and centuries have done what they always do. Blur the edges and start arguments about numbers. Chroniclers disagree on details, how often, how many, where exactly, because terror distorts record-keeping, and record-keeping was never perfect to begin with. Some accounts sharpen to shock. Some soften to defend. Some mix politics with eyewitness fragments. And later writers repeat the most dramatic version because dramatic versions survive like stubborn weeds. This is where history becomes very human in a strangely sleepy way. People want certainty. They want a clean number, a clear list, a reliable label. But the past often refuses. The past gives you competing reports, bias pins, and memories shaped like a mirror that keeps changing as you move. And the odd truth is that the system doesn't need perfect numbers to have worked. The system needs belief. If a city opens its gates because it fears a story, then the story has already become a force, regardless of whether the arithmetic is precise. So what do we do with that at bedtime? We hold it gently. We keep the facts at arm's length, like a librarian handling an old page that could tear if you're too intense about it. We let the core idea remain clear without turning it into a spectacle in our minds. The core idea is simple. Power used visibility. Power used rumor. Power used the human tendency to imagine the worst and then behave accordingly. Hold the scene at a distance now. Moonlight on stone. Wind over empty ground. A warning that doesn't need to shout because it has already been repeated enough times. Let the story stay calm because calm can be strangely persuasive. Calm makes room for the quiet details. A traveler choosing silence. A messenger choosing safer roads. A scribe dipping a pen and writing numbers that might be wrong, but consequences that are real. And if you end softly, you end without a conclusion that snaps like a book closing. You end like a voice trailing off in a room that stays dim. The night settles. The horizon blurs. The message keeps standing quiet, readable. And cold and no, it becomes just another distant shape in the mind. And then even that shape loosens because sleep, unlike empires, doesn't need to be believed to arrive. You might not expect a ruler to speak through architecture, but history has always had a talent for turning walls into sentences. Sometimes the sentence is a gate that says welcome, sometimes it's a tax notice nailed to a post, and sometimes it's a shape on the horizon that convinces a traveler to lower their voice before they even know the city's name. If your room is quiet, let it stay that way. Let the quiet be the main character, if anything is allowed to be a main character at all. Somewhere in the distance, imagine a desert wind combing dust the way a careful hand combs hair, slow enough that it never snags. A drum fades until it's more like the idea of a drum. And close to you, the patient sound of stone tapping stone keeps time like someone counting coins they do not intend to spend. A small whisper just to anchor you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You can answer in your head or not answer at all. In the Timurid world, unanswered questions were common, but so were records. And records have a way of pretending that everything was answered neatly. Timur's campaigns are usually described with movement horses, banners, speed, the sudden appearance of an army where nobody wanted one. But the part that lingers, the part that stays behind like a smell on fabric, is the quiet afterward, emptied streets, sealed gates, a marketplace that still has grain but not much conversation. The feeling that a city has been read quickly, like a letter opened with impatient fingers, skimmed, and then folded again with no promise of kindness. A road behind an army can look boring in an almost soothing way. Wheel ruts, pressed grass, a dropped strap buckle that nobody bothered to pick up because nobody wanted to bend down in a place where bending down feels risky. Inns that are open but subdued, as if the walls themselves have decided to whisper. There is a particular kind of silence you hear when people are trying not to create a new reason to be noticed. It's not the silence of peace. It's the silence of carefulness, which is a different habit altogether. And it makes even your footsteps sound like a decision. Fear travels farther than soldiers, partly because fear doesn't need to eat. It only needs to be repeated. It rides on merchants, pilgrims, envoys, and the friendly strangers at roadside inns who ask, in a voice that sounds casual, "So, how is the road?" The answer becomes a currency. Stories are traded the way people trade dried fruit. Small, portable, and oddly sticky. The landscape becomes part of the message. Crossroads become punctuation marks. A lone watchtower becomes a comma. A line of empty houses becomes a long dash. And in stories about Timur, the horizon sometimes holds the most infamous punctuation of all, the so-called towers of skulls. The phrase arrives with a weight that makes people speak louder, which is inconvenient for bedtime, so we'll keep our voice low and our details gentle. Chroniclers describe structures meant to intimidate, meant to remain after an army moved on, meant to speak to the next city before any negotiation begins. The numbers vary. The locations vary. The certainty varies. Some accounts sharpen to shock. Some soften to defend. Some are written long after the fact, when memory has already been edited by fear and politics. But the underlying logic is stubborn. A visible consequence is an administrative tool. It does not require the army to stay. It does not require anyone to remember every detail, only the feeling that resistance carries a cost. There is a cold efficiency to leaving behind a message that can be read from far away. A message that must be read up close is personal. A message that can be read from a distance is policy. It's like posting a sign that says closed, except the sign is designed to close your imagination too. An imagination, being helpful in the worst ways, fills in whatever details it thinks will keep you alive. The towers are not built for beauty in the retellings. They are built for recognition. They turn defeat into a public sign. They transform a battlefield outcome into a rumor that arrives before the horses do. Whether the details are exaggerated or not, the point stays the same. Visible consequence, visible control. A structure that keeps speaking long after the army rides on, like a sentence that refuses to end. Now let the scene drift to the places where systems are born. The scribes, the messengers, the counting rooms, and the noisy quiet of conversation. A message needs an audience, and the Timurid world had many. Traders moving goods, pilgrims moving prayers, envoys moving careful words, and innkeepers moving bowls of something warm. A caravanserai is basically a medieval forum with better horses and worse hygiene. Everyone arrives dusty. Everyone is tired. Everyone has a story they've been carrying, and stories have a way of unloading themselves as soon as someone offers water. Rumors sharpen as they travel. Many becomes countless. I heard becomes I saw, because I saw feels like a premium subscription version of the truth. People add details the way someone adds spice, not because the meal needs it, but because the listener stays awake a little longer when the story has texture. And fear, inconveniently, is excellent at keeping attention unless you speak about it softly, like we are, in which case it becomes a kind of distant weather. Scribes record, enemies repeat, survivors warn their children. Children turn warnings into legends because legends feel easier to carry than raw anxiety. Soon the tale outruns the facts, but not necessarily the effects. The odd truth is that fear doesn't require perfect accuracy. It requires consistency. If 3 different travelers tell you resistance ends badly, you do not stop to verify the footnotes. You start choosing safer roads. You start practicing politeness the way someone practices a musical scale. Slowly, not because it's beautiful, but because it keeps your hands steady. If you're still awake by the time we reach the quiet mathematics of rumor, you can subscribe. Or don't. Timur would probably have preferred a sealed document and a witness. But in modern life, a button will do, and no one has to ride a horse to deliver it. This is how terror becomes a system, not as a constant scream, but as a routine. A predictable set of expectations. A kind of governance that doesn't need to be present everywhere because it lives in the way people behave. It redraws maps without ink. It shifts trade routes with nothing but conversation. It convinces someone to open a gate early because the alternative feels like gambling with the future. And humans are rarely relaxed gamblers when the stakes are their city. There's arithmetic in it too, the quiet kind that pretends to be neutral. One city resists and becomes an example. Another submits and is spared. The lesson becomes a simple equation: obey and survive. That is not morality. That is policy wearing the disguise of math. And policy loves math because math looks calm, even when it is describing something unkind. Selective mercy fits into the mechanism like a well-oiled hinge, not because it is kind, but because contrast is persuasive. If every city suffers the same, punishment becomes background noise. But if one place is crushed and the next is spared, everyone begins trying to become the spared city. Mercy turns into a lever, not a mood. Relief becomes something the system can offer with invisible conditions, like a coupon you're grateful for, even if you don't fully understand the fine print. You can imagine councils meeting under low light, counting grain and arrows and the patience of their people. Someone says, maybe the rumors are exaggerated, and someone else says, maybe, but what if they're not? And the room slowly realizes that exaggeration doesn't matter as much as possibility. Possibility changes behavior. A rumor can be a weapon, even if the number inside the rumor is wrong, because the rumor persuades people to move, to submit, to keep their voices low. Now let the scene shift again, gently, into the night mind, the private place where public messages do their longest work. Imagine being a traveler who sees an outline on the horizon before hearing the name of the city. You slow your horse. Your voice drops. Every sound feels sharper than it should, as if the air itself is listening. You become careful in a way that looks like manners. You don't argue. You don't bargain as aggressively. You don't stare. You learn quickly that survival sometimes looks like being very polite on purpose. The structure, whether you see it or only believe it exists, does its work without needing new violence. That is the efficiency of reputation. It becomes self-maintaining. It persuades a person to behave before any soldier appears, which is convenient for the empire and exhausting for the nervous system. And the nervous system, sadly, does not submit a complaint form. It simply adapts. It turns fear into routine. There is a quiet irony in how people can live under a warning once the warning becomes familiar. Trade continues. Bread is baked. Water is carried. Someone complains about the price of onions because history almost never cancels the price of onions. Life keeps functioning, only a little tighter, a little quieter, a little more cautious. The message becomes boring, and that is exactly when it becomes powerful, because boring things are stable. They don't require constant attention to remain present in the background. This is also how Timur becomes inevitable in some retellings. To admirers, he is a ruler whose power shapes geography and history like a heavy tool, blunt and effective. To victims and rivals, he is a lesson in what power looks like when it wants to be seen. Both versions feed the same machine. A reputation so heavy, it behaves like an army of its own, arriving ahead of the horses, setting up camp inside imagination, and charging rent in the form of caution. Once reputation becomes architecture, it is hard to dismantle. You can tear down a structure, you can rebuild a wall, but you cannot easily tear down a thought once it has entered language. People rebuild it in warnings. They rebuild it in the way parents tell children not to wander too far from the road. They rebuild it in the way merchants choose routes with fewer question marks. Even people who doubt the literal details may still feel the weight, because doubt is slow and fear is fast, and in a tired world, speed often wins. Now we drift into the long after, when hooves have faded and dust has settled, and centuries have done what they always do, blur edges and start arguments about numbers. Chroniclers disagree on details, how often, how many, where exactly, because terror distorts record-keeping, and record-keeping was never perfect in the first place. Some accounts sharpen to shock, some soften to defend, some mix politics with eyewitness fragments, and later writers repeat the most dramatic version because dramatic versions are the ones that survive copying. This is where history becomes very human, in a strangely sleepy way. People want certainty. They want a clean number, a clear list, a reliable label. But the past often refuses. It offers competing reports, biased pens, and memories shaped like a mirror that changes as you move. The odd truth is that the system did not need perfect numbers to have worked. It needed belief. If a city opened its gates because it feared a story, Then the story already became a force, regardless of whether the arithmetic was precise. So the problem of numbers is really a problem of memory, and memory is not an accountant. Memory is a storyteller. It edits, it emphasizes, it forgets the parts that don't fit the lesson. Sometimes it remembers the warning and forgets who benefited from repeating it. History, in that sense, is a shelf of books where some volumes have been handled so often the pages are soft, and others have been left untouched, crisp but lonely. For bedtime, we hold the scene gently. We keep the facts at arm's length, like a librarian handling an old page that could tear if you grip it too hard. We allow the core idea to remain clear without turning it into spectacle. The core idea is simple. Power used visibility. Power used rumor. Power used the human tendency to imagine the worst and then behave accordingly, because behavior is what systems want. Hold the scene at a distance now. Moonlight on stone. Wind over empty ground. A warning that does not need to shout because it has been repeated enough times. Let the story stay calm, because calm can be more unsettling than drama, and also more sleep-friendly, which is an odd combination that history provides more often than you'd think. If you end softly, you end on the human detail. A traveler choosing silence, a city choosing surrender, a messenger choosing safer roads, a scribe dipping a pen and writing numbers that might be wrong, but consequences that were real. The night settles, the horizon blurs. The message keeps standing quiet, readable, and cold, until it becomes just another distant shape in the mind. And then even that shape loosens because sleep has its own empire, and it is patient. The wind keeps combing dust. The stone keeps tapping stone. The stories keep their distance. And if your eyes are heavy, you don't need to solve anything. You can simply let the road go dark and let the silence do its slow work.